Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
A big announcement from the federal government on plans for a high-speed rail line. And yes, you've probably heard this story before. The idea has been thrown around for decades without any progress or shovels in the ground. But could this time be different? I'm Kris McCusker, and today on The Big Story, we speak to an expert about this project, which could cost up to $65 billion, and where the challenges lie. Lavagnon Ika is professor of project management at the Telfer School of Management at the University of Ottawa. Thanks so much for doing this.
You're welcome, Kris.
So what were your initial thoughts on the announcement?
So I would suggest that it's a wonderful announcement. It's a transformational project, and it's one that is welcome.
Is there anything about it? I mean, I know there are a lot of unknowns in the announcement that was made, but is there anything that caught your eye or was worrisome, or like you had more questions based on what you've heard so far?
The only challenge is the timing of the announcement so far, because, we know that the current government is not going to stay in power, and that we are bound for a change in government, right? So which means that this project is at risk of being put on hold by the next government or simply being cancelled by the next government. So that's the only challenge. But we know that this project was in the books and that the federal government was working on it. The first time, I can tell you that the first time I heard about the project was more than 10 years ago, where the Via Rail CEO at the time floated the idea of a high-frequency rail, right? And they were suggesting that it would cost $3 billion to produce that high-frequency rail. And now it seems that Canadians want a high-speed rail, and I could understand why they would want a high-speed rail.
Well, and it's interesting because, Canada is like the only G7 nation without high-speed rail.
I was going to say the same thing. To me, personally, being somebody, because I'm a professor of project management and I travel a lot, and being somebody that travels in Europe, I can tell you that it's a little bit embarrassing that we do not have a high-speed train, or a TGV, as they call it in France, right?
It sort of makes you wonder at this point, right? They're talking about it. It sounds good. You make a good point about, potential government change. And it makes you wonder if it's really going to happen. I mean, this is an idea that's been floated since the 1970s.
That's well said, Kris. But we gotta say that, we've moved past a hurdle for once. So you're right to suggest that this idea has been circulating for decades. But what we now have is that for once, there is a government that committed for almost $4 billion to the design phase of a project, which is unprecedented. That's a commitment. You see, if you consider the O-Train or the Ottawa LRT here, it's a $2 billion project for phase one. But guess what? For this project, the federal government is committing $4 billion already.
Okay, so does that make it more likely to happen?
Yeah, because basically it means that, the current government at least is putting their mouth where their money is, basically, or at least committing money to a project, which makes it more plausible to be undertaken.
Is there anything, do you think, about this project that is similar in any other part of the world? Like, I know there are questions about, like the Via Rail line, there's conflict with freight rail. Are there any similarities based on what you've heard for this high-speed rail that, there would sort of be a precedent to follow?
Yes, this issue of, the freight rail and the passenger rail being shared was the very reason why we could not increase the speed. Via Rail, not we. I don't work at Via Rail. That was the reason why Via Rail could not increase the speed of the current train that we have. Because, both the passenger track and the freight track are the same. So they share the same track. But that was very pertinent for the high frequency rail option that Via Rail was contemplating, you see, Kris? So right now, we're not talking about the high frequency rail, which would have been cheaper, but would not have created much value for Canadians. Because basically, what is going to happen with the high-speed train, or the TGV in France, in French, is that, well, we're going to have the time to commute between Montreal and Toronto. Okay, it's going to be split in half, right? Which is wonderful. Now, I'm not aware of any other project that is having the similar challenges when it comes to a high-frequency rail or Via Rail, but I'm quite sure that you have other projects in the world like California Light Rail, which is already having a $100 billion cost increase as compared to the initial budget.
Cost increase, cost overrun, you mean?
No, I'm not going to say overrun because right now the project has not yet even started, right? So you can consider it technically as a cost increase. So basically, because we are still in the planning phase for the project. You understand what I mean? Most of the time when we talk about overrun, it's at the execution phase.
Now, California's weather is very different than ours. Does that create challenges?
Yeah, that's a challenge for sure, because you've seen that with the Ottawa Light Rail, although we can't compare it in terms of size and scope to these the largest project in the modern history of Canada, the Prime Minister put it. The Light Rail had challenges when it comes to its first winter. The Montreal REM, the Réseau électrique métropolitain in Montreal, is also having challenges due to winter.
There's also, it opens up a lot of opportunity on the tourism side. I mean, it's not just about this is a service that Canadians want, but this is the possibilities are endless if it takes 2 hours to go from Montreal to Toronto.
For 3 hours, it would take 3 hours of. That's what they are planning. 3 hours, not 2. But that being said, you're right. So it's going to open up more opportunities to commute between Montreal and Toronto, and not just Montreal. If you consider the whole corridor between Toronto, Peterborough, Ottawa, Montreal, Laval, Trois-Rivières, and Quebec City. So people will be able to move a little bit more easily, and it's going to take less time, which is good for business, which is good for tourism, and it's also good for workers if they want to commute between the cities, and it's good for business between the two provinces of Quebec and Ontario.
One argument I heard was that this is an area that's already well served by planes, but it's much easier to go and get on a train than it is to get on a plane.
You got it. No, that's a good argument, but basically, if you go around cities like Paris, is Paris it's the Paris agglomeration not well served by planes?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
for me, that is an argument that does not work much. and by the way, Kris, Air Canada for once is part of the consortium that will work on the project, as compared to years ago, where they see this project as much as a competition.
Would this project make Via Rail redundant?
That's a wonderful question. I have not thought about that, to tell you the truth. But at first, I would not consider that Via Rail is going to become redundant, basically, because it would seem to me that the passenger track that they have right now is not going to be much useful, but they will continue with the freight track.
Okay, so if we're to sum this up, you do see challenges here.
The first challenge that comes to mind, like I said, we talked about that before, that's challenge number one, a change of government, a change in priorities of the next government. So that's the challenge. So that's the first risk. The second challenge is the challenge of cost overruns. I alluded to that. So if the consortium and the Crown Corporation and the federal government and anybody involved in the project, they do not put their act together, then we run the risk of a huge cost overruns, because research has shown that this large scale, and this one is a mega project, they tend to experience cost overrun. And my own research suggests that half of them do experience cost overrun. So watch out for cost overruns. So that's the second thing that I would like to say. The third thing that I would like to say is this is a public partnership project, a public-private partnership project, a PPP project. So would the service be on top of expectation, on par with expectations? Because, the service is going to be run not by the government, right? It's going to be run by the private sector. So will it be on par with expectations? So we know that for PPPs, service quality and service performance in the long run is going to be a challenge. And that tends to be a challenge in many PPPs. So these are other considerations that we need to have here.
Let me ask you one question, and this might be unfair, but I'm curious.
Yeah.
If you had to guess today, does this happen?
That's a great question, and I don't think it's unfair at all, a question. It's reasonable, right? You asked me to predict the future. It's always challenging to predict the future, as you know. But basically, what I'm going to suggest, I'm going to bet on the power of the need for such a transformational project. And the needs are there. And because of the power of the needs, Canadians expect value to be created from this project. And that part of the value is the fact that we're going to halve, the time to commit between Montreal and Toronto. That alone is a powerful driver behind the project. And I think that the next government, will be wise in keeping the project alive.
Here's one more unfair question, maybe. How long does it take?
It will take a long time. So you see, the design phase, as suggested by the federal government and the Prime Minister, would take 4 to 5 years. And I'm quite sure that the execution itself will take a little bit more than 5 years. So it's going to be at least 10 years. But guess what? The most important thing is not whether or not the project will overrun its schedule and cost. The most important thing is whether or not the project will create enough value to offset its cost.
But you're not going to know that until decades later, are you?
Exactly. That's the whole point. And you see, we have a number of projects in our landscape now that are bold, that were bold ambitions at the time, but had they not been built, Canada would not have been what it is right now. Think about the Rideau Canal, for instance.
Right, the Rideau Canal. So there's a risk.
There's a risk, but at the same time, there is an upside for these kind of projects, which is the value it creates. Not just the jobs that it's going to create. Let's start first and foremost with the initial value that the project is supposed to create, which is going to have the time to commit between all of these cities.
Well, thank you so much for offering your insight on all of this. You were very thorough, and it's much appreciated. It's going to be interesting to watch.
Indeed.
Lavagnon Ika is professor of project management at the Telfer School of Management at the University of Ottawa. You can follow us on X at The Big Story FPN. You can also listen to The Big Story and other frequency podcasts like The Roz and Mocha Show on our Seeker app. That's SEEKR. I'm Kris McCusker. Thanks for listening.